Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Diploma in Photography. A very quick sound check before we go any further, just to make sure that everybody can hear me there loud and clear. So just type in yes or type in Y into the chat. Okay, so I can see lots and lots and lots of yeses coming in there. Um, yeah, excellent, fantastic stuff, guys. Well, welcome back to lesson 2 in Diploma in Photography. Great to see you all back. I hope everybody enjoyed lesson 1. I can see lots of questions coming in there from students just before the lesson about the toolkits. Okay, those two kits should be in your student login area now. There was a little bit of a delay in those going up, but you should be able to find those toolkits in your student login area now. So you'll find the summary notes, the bonus lessons, and the webinar slides from lesson 1 there in your login area. So just a little bit of housekeeping to get through before we get into the content of this evening's lesson. So tonight we are going to be having a look at your camera's functions. We're going to be digging deeper into some of those buttons that you may or may not know what they do on your camera, and we're going to have a look at lenses as well, and more importantly we're going to see how our camera sees versus how we see, and it's a very important distinction to make between the two of them. So you are here with myself, William Eames. I am your educator throughout this photography course, if this happens to be your first lesson this evening. And you've got loads and loads of questions coming in there, but we have our support team here as well to help you out too on the lessons. So anything that I don't get a chance to answer, they will, they're frantically typing away there, trying to keep up with your questions, but they will get to you as well. And of course, we will have our Q&A session at the end as well, and I'll certainly grab some of your questions then too. So just to remind you as well about the competition that we announced in the first lesson for that Premium Plus membership. The winner will be announced live during lesson 4. So that winner is going to get access to all the courses we have here in Shaw Academy, a full 12 months to Shaw Academy. And as we were saying as well, your toolkits are going to be available for you for the first 4 lessons as well. Simply attend the lessons and you'll find those in your student login area after the lesson is shown. Okay, so the first lesson, the first toolkit should be there in your student login area now as well. You can check that out after the lesson. So let's have a look at what we are going to cover this evening. So the first thing we are going to have a look at are some of the basic functions that are found on most cameras. And this is going to help you to demystify some of those dials and buttons. I won't go into huge detail with all of them, as this will naturally come back up throughout the course as we progress on. We'll be having a look at these buttons again. But I just want to get you familiar with them this evening. I'd also just like to mention that typically most cameras have these buttons, but they may be located in different places, and some functions they might not even be on the camera body itself, but they could actually be in the menu too. So I always recommend that you have your camera manual close by if you find out something new, so that you can check it out on your own camera. And this will be important as the course progresses, as I may mention something that you haven't seen before, and then you'll be able to quickly look it up and see if your camera has the function. Okay, so we are going to have a look at how the camera sees versus human vision as well. So this is a very important distinction to make, because how we see versus how our cameras see is very, very different, and this is going to be very important when it comes to understanding different types of lenses. And I know you've got loads and loads of questions about lenses, but we'll be hopefully answering some of those a little bit later on in the lesson. Then of course we'll have our summary. We'll do a little bit of course interaction with our Q&A as well. So is everybody ready to get into the lesson? Fantastic, excellent. I hope everybody is very, very excited. Great stuff. So why do we want to learn about our camera's functions? Why is this important? Well, this is about gaining a technical understanding of your camera. Photographers should know their cameras and what they are using and what their cameras are capable of. So understanding your camera, you're going to know exactly what it is you're going to be able to achieve with it. You're going to know what its limitations are, or perhaps areas where it excels as well. We spent a lot of money on cameras. I'm sure we all agree on that. We've all spent a lot of money on cameras, on equipment, and it's completely wasted if we don't know the camera's full potential. You know, so if you've bought lenses, if you bought flashes, perhaps you bought other accessories like battery grips and so on, and if you don't don't know how to use them, you're never going to get the most out of them. So once we are confident, we can approach things with more confidence, and that means we're going to be taking better photographs. You'll hear me say this a lot throughout the course, but confident photographers are good photographers because they are happy. And we can only become confident when we know the equipment that we are using. Okay? And it's similar with our lenses as well. We need to know how we can use our lenses and our camera functions. We need to understand the capabilities of the equipment that we are using. And as I said, this will help to increase our confidence and our visual awareness. Okay, so visual awareness is our ability to understand all the different views and how we can approach them in any particular scene with all these different lenses. Okay, so expanding these creative skills and creative potential will allow you to broaden your approach to your photography and allow you to capture the photograph the way that you want to. Now, so let's get right into it. So the first thing is we're going to be having a look at our DSLR, from lesson 1, and simply using the DSLR. But the main reason for this is that, well, the majority of us are using DSLRs, as we kind of established in the first lesson. But it's also that DSLRs have most functions. Okay, so these typically will have all the functions that we need as photographers. Now, most icons most icons and functions on cameras are universal, so don't worry if you don't have a DSLR. If you're using a bridge camera or a mirrorless camera or something similar, you are going to see lots of the same functions and the same buttons. And again, if I mention something that you haven't seen before, please refer to your camera's manual, so that you can see if your camera has it as well. Okay, so the first one to have a look at is how many of you have a camera that has a mode selector or a dial that looks very similar to this? Yeah, I can see lots and lots and lots of yeses coming in. Some people saying no there as well. If you haven't got something that looks like this, more than likely these functions are going to be in the camera's menu itself. But if your camera has something like this, this is our mode selector, and this is simply the dial that allows us to change the functions or the way the camera makes the photograph. Now, as I said, with point and shoot cameras, these are a little bit more basic, so you may find these in the menu itself to change the shooting modes. Okay, but the first one, I'm sure we're all familiar with this, and this is the one that we probably are all here to get away from, is the automatic mode. How many of you are here to get away from that automatic mode? The chat box has just absolutely exploded there. Yeah, I think that's why we are all here. We want to get away from automatic mode. Now, automatic mode tells the camera to make the best judgment about in terms of the settings to capture the correct picture for you. So basically, automatic mode just wants to get the exposure correct, so you get a photograph that looks good. And this can be great for trying to capture a scene without having to think too much about the technical side. It's great, if you just want to go out, you just want to point and shoot, you want to relax and just enjoy yourself. However, using automatic mode, the camera has no idea what you want to capture. It doesn't know whether you want to, say, freeze a moving subject like a car, or maybe you want to blur that subject. It has no idea whether you want to blur a background in a portrait, or if you want to keep everything sharp and focused like in a landscape. It does not know what your creative vision is for the scene. And basically, automatic removes all the creative control, and it just captures the scene. It just wants to get the correct amount of light in the scene with whatever combination of settings works best for it. Okay, so when we look at things like camera shutter speeds and apertures and so on, the difference between having control and using automatic functions becomes very quickly apparent. Okay, so another kind of semi-automatic mode is our program mode. Okay, so how many of you have a camera that would have a program mode on it and have wondered what the program mode is? Because this is one I think that confuses quite a lot of students. They often ask me, well, what's the difference between the program mode and the automatic mode? Well, program is a semi-automatic function where your camera will still set your shutter speed and your aperture for you, but it will allow you to change a lot of the other settings. So For example, when we look at ISO a little bit later on in the course, we can change our ISO. We can also have a little bit of control over whether we want to over or underexpose the scene as well, with exposure compensation. And again, this is something we'll have a look at a little bit later on. It's essentially a more advanced automatic function that gives us back a little bit of control. Okay, so this is one that I would often use myself if I just want to go out and I just want to enjoy myself. Don't want to think too much about the technical aspect of my photography, but if I still need to make some changes, the program mode will allow me to do that. Moving over to the other side of the dial, we have these other icons here as well. I'm sure that we're all very familiar with these ones, and these are preset modes. So these, as you can see from these little icons, they're designed to suit certain scenarios that we would encounter frequently in our photography. Okay, now these are automatic modes, and when I say they only try to capture the subject the way that you want it, okay? The problem with any of these automatic functions is that the camera still does not know what your vision is for the scene. Okay, but these preset modes, they are useful in their own right as well. So we'll just break down these guys a little bit more. So the first one here, the sports and the action mode. This is where the camera is trying to give you a combination of settings to capture fast moving subjects. It wants to freeze action. And this is done by controlling the shutter speed, which we'll talk about in lesson 4. And this is a really good mode for obviously for people playing sports, for moving vehicles, for wildlife and so on. But can anybody give me an example of where we might use this in our day-to-day photography? Okay, so where, apart from our sports and our wildlife, where might, yeah, there we go, Merlise, you're absolutely spot on, Teresa. Tanya is spot on there as well, and Kathy. Children, absolutely, this is such a good mode for photographing children because they don't stop moving. So these modes, they're not just restricted to things like sports and action, but you can think about this in terms of your everyday photography as well. Okay, so if you're photographing children and so on, and we know, toddlers in particular, they move very, very quickly. This is a good mode to use for them when they're running around the place as well. So, think about this with these types of modes as well. They're not just limited to one style of photography. Okay, and I can see somebody else mentioning your pets. Natasha, you're saying your pets there as well. Yeah, absolutely. Dogs or anything like that, that's moving very, very fast. This is a good mode to use for shooting them. Then we have our landscape mode. So our landscape mode is a little bit more straightforward, and this is basically a mode that tries to keep all objects in your photograph in focus. So rather than images where the background is out of focus or the foreground is out of focus, this mode tries to make sure that everything is in focus, from the closest object in the foreground to the furthest object in the horizon in the background. The reason it uses this little landscape icon is because typically, but not always, photographers like to keep everything in focus from the foreground to the background when shooting landscape. Sharpness is very, very important to them. But again, this mode can be applied to any type of subject. It doesn't always just have to be a landscape. Then we have our macro mode. We are going to be talking a little bit about macro a little bit later on in the lesson in terms of lenses, but we do have a macro mode on our camera as well, and this mode allows you to move closer to the subject to take close-up photographs. It won't allow you to get very intricate, detailed macro photographs, but it's a good one for, say, photographing flowers like the icon, insects, or any subject where you just need to get that little bit closer in and capture it. Now, this function has its limits, but it will get you much closer than any of these other modes. But for true macro photography, we do need the correct lenses, and we're going to speak about those lenses a little bit later on. Then finally we have our portrait mode, and again this is a combination of settings that's best designed for shooting portraits. Now what this really means is that it tries to capture pictures where the background is soft, it's out of focus, but the subject that's close to the camera, or or person that we're photographing, is going to be in focus. And this is a technique that's commonly used in portrait photography, but again this can be applied to anything, an object that you may want to photograph with the background out of focus and so on. So do we understand those 4 modes a little bit better now? Excellent. So moving it back over to the other side of the dial, there's just three left that we have a look at, and we're going to be digging deeper into these in upcoming lessons. Okay, so this one here, don't get it confused with your automatic mode. This is aperture value mode, and it may appear as AV on your cameras as well. It can either appear as A or AV. Basically, this particular mode will allow you to control just the aperture in your camera. Okay, and we're going to be seeing this in future lessons, but the aperture will allow us to control the depth of field in our photographs. And don't worry if you don't understand what that means at this stage. It is something that we will be looking at in lesson 4. But if we want to take control of only the aperture, we can select this mode and the camera will handle everything else for us. The next one is our shutter priority mode. It works in a very similar way. This will allow us to just control our shutter. Okay, so it might appear as TV on your cameras as well, which stands for time value. So basically this mode works similar to the aperture priority mode, but instead of controlling the aperture, we're controlling the shutter speed in the camera, and that will allow us to control things like the motion. And again, we'll dig deeper into that in lesson 4. But when we use this mode, it means that we control the shutter and the camera controls everything else for us. And Daniel, I see you asking what is aperture. Well, don't worry about it for the moment, Daniel. We will be looking at that in lesson 4, and we'll be coming back to those two modes in that lesson as well. For the moment, I just want you to get familiar with them. And then finally, the holy grail for photographers at this level. How many of you are here to move on to that M mode? Excellent. Everybody's saying yes. Everybody's saying me. Yes, please. Fantastic. Brilliant. Yeah, this is why we are here. This is what we are working up towards. In this course is getting to fully manual mode. Fully manual mode allows us to have full control over our aperture, our shutter speed, our ISO, our focusing, our light metering modes. Pretty much every setting that the camera has to offer. And this setting takes a little bit of time to master, but ultimately it gives you full creative control, and it allows you to expand your photography and your capabilities with your photographs. And this is what we're going to be building up over the next few weeks, and we'll bring it all together then in lesson 8. And what you'll see by the time we get to lesson 8 is that we will have laid the foundations, and it's not as tricky or as daunting as it might feel right now. But when we get to that stage, you'll really see the potential with this mode too. Just a couple of other icons as well to be aware of on your cameras too. This one here, our image playback, is pretty self-explanatory. This is one that we can review our photographs with. We simply hit the image playback and we can go through our shots. And we would also have a zoom option as well when we're in the image playback, that we can zoom in and out on the photograph. Now, can anybody tell me why we might want to zoom in and out of the photograph when it's on our LCDs, on our playback? What important thing must we check? Yes, and ours, you're absolutely right. Alan, yeah, you're spot on there as well. Exactly, Paul. Yeah. Now I see some people mentioning noise. Yeah, we'd absolutely try to see if there's any noise in the photograph, and we'll speak about that later. But sharpness, we want to make sure that the photograph is sharp and in focus. So it is a good idea when we're reviewing our photographs, to zoom in on the photographs now and again, just to make sure that everything is nice and sharp. There's nothing worse when you go home, you put up all your photographs onto your computer, ones that you really liked, and suddenly you find out that they're not sharp, that they're a little bit soft, they're a little bit out of focus. It's a little bit of a nightmare. So you want to be doing this quite regularly, zooming in and making sure that everything is acceptable to you. Okay, then we have this one here as well. I'm sure we're all very familiar with it too, simply to delete our photographs. Now, one thing I would say to you as well with deleting your shots is to show a little bit of restraint. We're very critical of our own photography. I'm sure everybody would agree with me on that when it comes to looking at our own shots, we can be very quick to delete our photographs. Okay, for me, I think you should show a little bit of restraint, because you can often change your feeling about a photograph after a little bit of time. So I would leave the deletion until you get your photographs onto your computer, when you get a chance to have a better look at them. Okay, because you don't want to delete something that afterwards you're going to regret, and it does happen. I've certainly deleted shots and I wish I hadn't deleted them. So show a little bit of restraint. If you're on the fence about a photograph, I don't think you should get rid of it. Now obviously there's always going to be those shots that are totally useless. You want to get rid of those, especially if you're running out of space on your memory card. But otherwise, just show a little bit of restraint, a little bit of patience, and you might find that you're happy that you didn't delete that photograph. Okay. So finally then, some cameras will have this option as well, which will allow you to directly print from your camera. So for example, Canon cameras would have this this option where you can directly print from their printers using Wi-Fi or using Bluetooth and so on through this direct printing option as well. Okay, so a lot of our cameras have built-in Wi-Fi on them, and a lot of our printers have built-in Wi-Fi on them now as well, so that they will talk to each other. And we have this option now to directly print off our photographs as well. So I really would recommend as well printing off your photographs too. And, it's nice to have a shot that you've put a lot of effort and a lot of time in, and you print it off, you have it in your hands, and you put it onto your wall. So don't forget to print off your photographs as well. Now, so do we understand our camera's functionality a little bit more? Has it demystified some of those buttons for you? Excellent. Now I see lots of questions coming in about separate topics, and so on related to photography. Don't worry, we will get to all of those questions at the end as well. But you also might find throughout the lesson that some of your questions will actually be answered in the content too. Okay, but our support will be there to try and get those questions for you as well. Now, so moving on, the next thing that we really need to have a look at and spend a little bit of time understanding are our camera's lenses. Okay, so as important as our camera is our lenses, and making the correct choice and understanding your lens is very, very important for the type of photography that you're going to want to do. Okay, so when we talk about lenses, the first thing that we need to establish is that they are essentially broken down into two main construction types, and that's zoom lenses and prime or fixed lenses. Okay, so I'm sure we've heard prime and fixed lenses before, and zoom lenses, and we'll have a look at the difference. So a zoom lens basically is a lens with a variable focal length. Okay, so, well, first of all, what's a focal length? Well, a focal length is the width or the zoom on the lens. So if we can see on the slide here, we can see that we have an 18 to 135 millimeter lens. When the focal length is very low, like 18 millimeters here, it's very, very wide. When the focal length increases, okay, to 135, that means we are more zoomed in. So to really simplify focal length, basically, it's the millimeter on your lens, and when it's lower, the lens is going to be wider, and when it's higher, the lens is going to be more zoomed in. That's a very simplified version of focal length, but it's all we need to understand at this stage. But does that make sense? So if you've ever seen the millimeters on your lenses and you've wondered exactly what that is, we refer to that as the focal length. And when it's low, it means we have a very wide angle, and when it's high, it means we're more zoomed in on the photograph. Okay, so zoom lenses allow us to change that focal length. So we can change, for example, on this one, from very wide, from 18 millimeters all the way up to 135 millimeters in this particular case. So we have a variety of options in terms of the focal length that we can choose. So this type of lens will cover lots of different scenarios. A very convenient type of lens for photographers to be using. The main advantages of these zoom lenses is that you don't need to carry around a load of different lenses of different focal lengths. You don't have to have a large selection of lenses in your kit. Now, from a price perspective, though, I mean, they can vary massively in price, depending on the quality. But typically, when we buy a camera, it's going to come with something like an 18 to 55 millimeter lens, and I'm sure many of you are using that type of camera or that type of lens at the moment, the kit lens. Absolutely, and it's a great lens to start with. And I can see, Tashkia, you're asking that, is it acceptable or is the quality not as good? I would strongly recommend that you learn to use that lens to its maximum before you make any decisions about purchasing another lens. It's absolutely acceptable, as someone has just said there on the support. Yeah, absolutely. So if you have that 18 to 55 millimeter lens, it's a great place to start. Now, the other type of lenses that we are going to be looking at are known as prime or fixed lenses. Prime or fixed lenses are lenses that have a fixed focal length. In other words, we can't zoom in or we can't zoom out with it. It's just fixed. Like, for example, with this lens here, it's at 50 millimeters, so I'd never be able to zoom in or ever be able to zoom out. Now, we can buy prime lenses of any focal length, so we can go from very wide to kind of general to telephoto. But you might be wondering, why would I buy loads of prime lenses when I'm going to have just one zoom lens that will cover a whole range of focal lengths? Well, the main advantages of prime lenses is that they tend to be higher quality and produce sharper photographs. They also tend to have much wider aperture ranges as well, meaning that they're more suitable for low light photography. But we'll speak about apertures, as I said, in lesson 4. Okay, they can be considerably cheaper in certain cases to zoom lenses within the same kind of range, but they can also go incredibly expensive as well. Okay, so there's a massive kind of range of prices on these types of lenses, but it really kind of comes down to the focal length that you're after and so on. But I'll answer some questions about lenses a little bit later on in the lesson as well. For the moment, just understand we're going to be looking at zoom lenses which have a variable focal length, and we're going to be looking at prime lenses which have a fixed focal length. So with that in mind, we can break down these two types of lens constructions into lots of different subcategories. So for example, normal or standard lenses are the ones that we're more than likely, most of us are using in our everyday photography. But we can get we can go wide angle, meaning we can go much wider in the focal length, meaning we can see more in the shot. You can get telephoto lenses to allow us to zoom in closer on a subject for things like wildlife photography. We've got super wide angle lenses. We've also got fisheye lenses. I can see someone just mentioning them there. We've also got specialist lenses like our macro lenses as well. And we're going to be having a look at all of these lenses. So, just breaking down the components on these lenses before we get stuck into these various lens types. Just have a quick look at some of the main components of a lens. And again, this is to get you familiar with the terminology. Okay, so first of all, the very first thing is our front lens element. This is the glass at the front of your lens. Now, when we talk about glass in our camera's lenses, the correct terminology is elements. Okay, so every single lens would have a couple of elements, or even a lot of elements inside the lens itself. But the one that we are going to see is the front lens element. Okay, and it's a specially designed type of lens, or complex piece of glass, similar to, say your glasses, if anybody wears glasses, perhaps a little bit more complex than that, but the same kind of concept that allows the light to enter through the lens. Then we have our manual focusing ring, so some lenses will allow you to manually focus the lens. Now, some of them might also have that placed on the very front of the lens as well, but this will basically allow you to manually focus if you're finding the autofocus is not doing it for you. Some lenses will also have this distance scale as well. Now, not every lens has this distance scale, but basically this distance scale is used for photographers to judge focus, or to capture focus, get good focus without having to look through the camera. It takes a lot of practice to get right, okay? But it is something photographers can use, is that they can actually judge the focus distance using the distance scale. We've also got a zoom ring, so if we have a zoom lens, we can zoom in and out using the zoom ring. We have our lens mount at the bottom. Now, just a quick note on your lens mount. The lens mount is the part of the lens that communicates with the camera. If you've ever taken the lens off your camera, I'm sure you've all seen that there's these little kind of copper or golden little attachments at the bottom of the lens. This is where the lens speaks to the camera. It's very, very important that you keep that protected. Have you ever seen that at the bottom of your lens? Now, I'm kind of referring to more newer lenses, the electronic lenses. Yeah, so I think we're all familiar with that. So anytime you've removed your lens, it's a good idea to put on that rear lens cap just to make sure that it's well protected. We have our autofocus and manual focus switch as well. So we could switch between autofocus and manual focus. So if you're finding, as I said, if the autofocus is not working for you, say you're photographing somewhere where the light's quite poor, you might find it difficult to get focus. You can switch it to manual focus. Just a point as well, because some students do get confused with this. If you shoot in fully manual, you do not have to have the camera set to manual focus. Okay, so if you change your modes on your camera, you can still use the autofocus or the manual focus if you prefer. It doesn't have to correspond with whatever mode it is you have your camera set to. Okay, and then we have a bayonet for a lens hood, and I saw somebody ask me earlier, what's that flower thingy attachment for? Well, that's our lens hood. Okay, so a lens hood is designed to reduce camera glare, camera flare within our photographs, and basically we have a bayonet there mount for it, so we can attach it to the front of the lens, and we also have a thread for lens filters. So if you have a look at our blogs, you'll see a little bit more about filters, and I talk about them in the gear guide that you'll find in your toolkit as well. But basically we can attach different types of filters to our lenses for different purposes. So if we need to, say, increase the exposure, we would use something like a neutral density filter. You might want to protect the lens using a UV filter and so on. Okay, but you will see that little thread on front of your lens as well. Okay, so those components, you will hear me mention them quite a bit as we go on throughout the course, and it's important to know, as I said, it's just important to know your equipment, to understand it and understand the terminology. And this also means, for example, if you're visiting a camera shop, or even if you're just having a discussion with another photographer and they start mentioning these terminology, these little kind of words to you, you're going to have an understanding of what they're talking about. Okay, so the next thing that we need to understand as well before we dig deeper into our lenses is we need to understand how lenses differ from each other, and we need to have a look at how it differs from our angle of view of human vision. So how we see versus how our camera sees is very different, and it's very, very important to understand this. So this is essentially the view that we see when we look straight ahead and how wide that view is. Now this is something that I want you to try out yourself. I want you to look straight forward, okay, just look straight forward, pick a point on the wall or something, and I want you to tell me, what do you think is the angle of view of human vision? Okay, so the angle of view of human vision. So say, is it 90 degrees, is it 180 degrees, or so on? What do you think is the angle of view of human vision? Okay, I see a couple of people say I've mentioned 180 and 90 just as examples, okay? Now just like if you think about this, 180 degrees would mean that you're going to be able to see to the immediate left and the immediate right whenever you look straight ahead, okay? So I'm just waiting to see. Lots of different answers coming in. Some people saying 45 degrees. I can see one person's got it spot on there. Wesley, you're totally correct. I can see 180 degrees, a lot of 140. 140 is very, very close. 135 is very, very close. Okay, so I think I've kept you in suspense for long enough. The actual angle of view of human vision is 130 degrees wide. 130 degrees wide, okay? So when we look straight forward, most humans, or every human, without moving our heads, will see an angle of view that's 130 degrees. So that's basically, if we stand still, we don't move our head, we don't move our eyes, and we just look forward, the view of the world is about 130 degrees. And you can see that in the slide here. Now, this might seem very, very wide. However, there is a very big difference between the width of view that we can see and the width of view that's actually in focus. So this is another distinction that we need to make. The extreme left and right of our angle of view is called our peripheral vision, and I'm sure we're all familiar with that, our peripheral vision. And in this area, our vision is blurry, and basically peripheral vision, it's a survival instinct. This is just so we have have an awareness of what's around us, okay? But it's not clear and it's not in focus until we either move our eyes or our head towards that area. So does everybody understand that for the moment, that we have this very wide angle of view, okay? But on the extreme lefts and the extreme rights, it's our peripheral vision. So, breaking that down a little bit further now, in terms of the area of view that's actually in focus, does anybody want to tell me what area of view is actually in focus? So again, if you want to try this and look straight forward, you know, if we're looking straight forward, how much of the degree of this 130 degree, how much of it's actually in focus? I can see Eugene's correct there, you're spot on. Tashka, you're very close, yeah, saying 70 there. You're close with 60, Julian. Very, very close. Okay, so yeah, it's a tough one. Okay, it's a very, very tough one. Lots of 60s, lots of 75s coming in, and you're very close, guys. But it is a little bit narrower than that. It is 50 degrees. Okay, so in reality, the area of our vision that's actually in focus is only about 50 degrees wide compared to that 130 degree angle of view. Okay, so this is the area that's actually sharp. And again, you can try this if you simply look straight forward and you concentrate on just what's in front of you. You know, you'll get a better sense of this as well. And this angle of view relates directly to what we see when we look through a camera's lens. As you change lenses, the angle of view that the lens will capture will either get wider or narrower, but the difference between the human angle of view and the angle of view of a lens is that the camera's lenses can keep everything sharp in its entire view. So unlike human vision, it does not blur on the peripheries. So if we are using a very wide angle lens, when we look through the camera, it's going to be all sharp to us. So, as we discuss the various lenses in this section, I'll show you that angle of view that these lenses have compared to our 130 degree angle of view. So, let's make this visual. It's a lot easier to understand because we are visual creatures as photographers. So, if we were to stand on this beach and look straight ahead, okay, so this is just us seeing for the moment. We're looking straight ahead on this beach, okay, enjoying the nice weather. We have about 130 degrees wide in terms of our angle of view, and this matches our, what we see. So this is, imagine our full field of view are 130 degrees wide. However, as we've just learned, we only have actually about 50 degrees of that in focus. So now I've exaggerated this a little bit, but here we can see what would actually be sharp, if we're talking about our own vision, and it's a much smaller area compared to the total angle of view. So if we're actually standing here, still looking straight ahead, only that little small area, that little square in the center would look in focus to our eyes. Now we still have a sense of the rest of the scene, but we wouldn't actually be clear until we turned our heads or we looked directly at it. Okay, so in reality, this peripheral vision wouldn't be as blurry as this, but as I said, it's just, I've emphasized this just to make it easier to see the difference, to get our heads around it. So the view from different camera lenses corresponds directly to this angle of view of human eyes, and understanding this concept will be extremely helpful to understanding the view from these different lenses. So, looking at our standard or our normal lens, okay, so one of the most standard lenses you can get out there is a 50mm lens, okay? So the standard or normal lenses are, this is a term that we would use for lenses that captures roughly the same angle of view that our eyes see in focus. So going back to our diagram, remember we have this 130 degree angle of view, but only about 50 degrees of that is actually in is in focus, as we can see here shown in pink. A standard lens can see roughly the same width or the same field as of our focused field of view. So in most cases, a standard or normal lens has a focal length of about 50mm. 50mm is about it's very, very close to what our eyes see in our day-to-day lives. Now, this can change slightly with some cameras, such as medium format cameras, or if we're talking about cropped sensors and so on. However, the principle is always the same. It's when the lens matches the width of the focused field of human vision. Okay, now 50 millimeters can either be set like a fixed 50 millimeter, or it can be on a zoom lens, something like that Canon 18 to 135 mil, and you simply set it to 50 millimeters. Okay, the nifty 50, Daniel, absolutely, and I'll speak about them a little bit in the Q&A as well. Now, to illustrate what this looks like in terms of how we would see it, we have an image here with our black outline, and the black outline is representing that a view that a 50 millimeter lens would have when the camera is pointed at the scene. So the image here represents the entire view that our eyes would have, but that little black square represents the view you would get through the camera's viewfinder if the camera has a 50 millimeter lens on. Does everybody understand that? So we're going to have a look at a lot of examples of this using our 50 millimeter as our starting point. Perfect. Excellent. So let's break this down a little bit more. So that little black square is what the 50 millimeter lens is seeing, and sure enough, if we take a photograph with that 50 millimeter lens, this is the kind of shot that we are left with. So we can see how much of the field of the total angle of human vision that is being lost here. Okay, so we're only focusing on 50 millimeters. This is just another way of looking at it. So if we actually stood here, we took the picture, this is what we would actually capture with our cameras. And these examples should start to help you get an understanding for what a standard or normal lens means. As I mentioned earlier, this is a term that appears all the time in photography, especially in books and websites. If you go into a camera shop and so on, you're going to hear this term quite a lot. Let's have a look at this compared with a wide angle lens. So you may or you may not be familiar with the term wide angle lens. However, it's another very common term in the photography world. Wide angle lenses are lenses that capture images which much wider than what our focused field of vision can see. So remember, our focused field of vision is 50 millimeters. Okay, so these lenses will capture a field of view that's wider than 50 millimeters. Okay, so they will start with a focal length from about 24 millimeters up to about 50 millimeters. Okay, and their angle of view is about 83 degrees wide. So anywhere from about 50 to about 83 degrees wide. So this will make a little bit more sense when we have a look at a visual example of this. So similar to the last example of that normal lens, just to visualize this, now the 50 millimeter is represented in red. We have a 24 millimeter lens in this particular case, and we can see the difference there. We're almost getting double the amount of area with the 24 millimeter. In fact, we're getting more than double with that 24 millimeter. We can see how much more of the scene that we take in with that 24 millimeter compared to our standard 50 millimeter lens. You can see it's significantly wider than what we can capture with that 50 millimeter lens. Can everybody see that difference quite clearly? And Christian, you said you thought the 24 millimeter would be smaller. Well, I'm glad that you can see the difference there, Christian, in that. And it's something that you've learned now and that you're going to remember is that that lower focal length is going to give you a wider photograph. And again, when you're thinking about, maybe investing in lenses and so on, you're going to have a better idea of what you should be looking for. Okay. So, if we were to take the photograph then with this 24 millimeter lens, we can see that we're capturing far more of this scene than with that 50 millimeter lens. Now, we're not getting everything here than our full focused our full field of vision, remember our 130 degree view, but we are capturing significantly more. So you can certainly see that this type of lens would be much more suitable for landscapes. Now it's not restricted to landscapes, but you certainly see that this type of lens is more suited or more suitable for that type of work. Now going on the other end of it, to the other extreme, a telephoto lens is any lens that has a focal length beyond the standard 50 millimeter of view. So anything higher than 50 millimeters generally is considered a telephoto lens. And these can range anywhere from 50 millimeters to some extreme examples of 1,000 millimeters. Very, very specialized lenses that are 1,000 millimeters. Telephoto lenses have an angle of view from about 50 degrees wide to as narrow as 2.5 degrees wide. Now, can anybody tell me where you might see these types of lenses being used? Where would we be familiar from these types of lenses being used in our everyday photography? I can see Rashawari, you're saying moon photography. Yeah, absolutely. Telephoto lenses are great. But I'm thinking much more along the line of sports, wildlife, paparazzi. Absolutely. Yes. I mean, they're all excellent examples. Journalists would certainly be using these types of lenses as well because it allows you to get closer to the subject if you can't physically get closer to them. So for sports, for wildlife, these types of areas where you can't disturb the wildlife, or obviously you can't get onto the football pitch to try and get a photograph, you're going to need to use something like these types of lenses. Okay, so they're great for sports photojournalism. They're actually very good for candid photography as well, because shooting candid style, you can keep a little bit of distance from the subject. So the kind of photographs we were looking at in the first lesson, these types of lenses are very suitable for that type of photography. So let's have a look at this with a 70mm lens. So 70mm is a little bit closer compared to our 50mm. So telephoto lenses have a narrower angle of view that our eyes can see with our angle of vision. So when we take the photograph, we're going to see the object be much bigger and it's going to have greater detail. So we can see that with a 70mm here. Okay, so it's not too much of a difference compared to the 50mm, but it is that little bit closer. So if we have a look at the photograph that we take with that 70mm, as you can see, it's getting that little bit closer now to the lighthouse, almost to the point where we're almost not even seeing the beach there at all, compared to our full angle of vision. So if we're going even further, say we go with a 100mm view, so we're increasing our telephoto distance to 100mm, and now we're getting, as you can see, it's 2 times closer to the lighthouse compared to our 50mm. It's 2 times closer to the lighthouse compared to that 50mm. And if we have a look at that, as you can see, you pretty much don't see the beach there at all. So you can see with these lenses, in this one scene, this one scenario, by changing these different lenses with these different focal lengths, how you were representing this particular scene and how different it is by simply changing that focal length. Are we getting a good sense of that? How in any one scene, by simply changing the focal length, you can completely change the type of photograph that you are taking. Now, Ian is just asking, you presume I'm talking about the full frame sensors, 35mm. Yes, Ian. So all of these examples are related to a 35mm sensor. Okay. Now, if you do want more information about sensors, again, check out the gear guide because there's a lot about the different types of sensors available to us there. So have a look at that in your toolkits afterwards as well. Now, so moving on to something incredibly extreme then, a 400mm lens is getting into the super telephoto range, and these lenses have incredible focal lengths and have an angle of view that's very narrow, around 6 degrees. Now, these types of lenses are also tend to be incredibly large in their size as well. So physically these lenses are huge, and this is due to their increased focal length. So using a lens like this, you may need to use a tripod, you may need to use a monopod to help stabilize them, and we'll discuss those in future in our lesson on shutter speeds. But I'm sure we're familiar with these types of lenses, as we were talking about our sporting events and so on. These are the types of lenses that they are going to be using in these types of scenarios. But as you can imagine, they're massive lenses at that focal length. And sure enough, if we take a photograph with that particular lens, as you can see here, we're so close to the lighthouse in this particular case. Okay, I mean, if I was to judge about the photographer's position in the original shot, standing on the beach, it could be standing about a kilometer or a kilometer or so away from the subject. So the next time you look at sports photography or wildlife photography and so on, you'll have a much better understanding of how they captured these types of photographs. So this also applies to zoom lenses as well. The whole idea here is the exact same with zoom lenses. So for example, if we're using a wide angle zoom lens like our 14 to 24mm here, on the left we have the lens zoomed out at 14mm, and on the right we have our 24mm zoomed in. Not too much of a difference, but pay attention to the edges of the frame. Okay, so again, it's still having quite a bit of an effect. We're losing this part of the photograph when we have a look at the 24 millimeter, and these are things to be aware of when you are taking photographs with zoom lenses. You don't want to accidentally cut out something from the photograph that you wanted to include. So always be sure when you are looking through your camera's viewfinder or on the camera's LCD, that you check the edges of the frame as well. So, if we have a look at this with our 70 to 200 millimeter lens, a very, very popular lens, again, you can see that there's a much more extreme difference between these two. So, zoomed out at 70 millimeters, we're getting a good sense of the beach, a good kind of decent landscape photograph. But zooming into 200 millimeters, we're focusing a lot more on that lighthouse. And I mean, again, this gives you a good idea, a good sense of what you might use these lenses for. Okay, as you can see with this type of lens, I would say that the 70 to 200 has certainly more range to it in terms of what you can do compared to that 20 or that 14 to 24 millimeter lens, which is very, very wide. A 14 to 24 millimeter lens, very good for, say, architectural photography, interior photography, and so on. But this type of lens would be also very much suited to kind of more general purpose in sports and wildlife and that as well. So I hope this has given you some good ideas as well. I mean, I always get questions from students about what lens should I go for. So if this is something that you are thinking about in the back of your head, hopefully this will give you a little bit more information about what to look out for. Now, there are some other types of lenses to be aware of as well. Some more specialist types of lenses, for example, are super wide angle lenses. So super wide angle lenses are lenses with a focal length that's wider than 24 millimeters. These can also be referred to as ultra wide angle lenses. And there are a few common lengths that super wide angle lenses will come in, such as 10 millimeters, 14 millimeters, or 16 millimeters. These are very, very wide. Now, they're not fisheye. I see some people saying fisheye. They're not as extreme as fisheye, but they are getting very, very close. So if we have a look at a shot with a super wide angle lens compared to our 50 millimeter view, you can see just how much more of the scene it gets in. So it's represented here in the gold, the 14 millimeter view, and it's getting nearly everything in within this particular landscape. So much more on the I suppose on the peripheries compared to that 50 millimeter. So it's getting as almost as wide as our 130 degree angle of view. And some lenses like a 10 millimeter would pretty much give us that entire 130 degree angle of view of human vision as well. So if we take a photograph with this lens, as we can see, we're getting a big wide photograph of the beach, of the water, and that the lighthouse is now just a tiny little spot in the center of the photograph. So if we have a look at these compared to each other, you can see just how close you get with that 400 millimeter to that extreme of that 14 millimeter. So they're the two extremes. But remember that 50 millimeter would be typically what we would see on a day-to-day basis, our general purpose lens. Okay, so it's a really good example there, seeing the extreme differences between those particular focal lengths. Now, I saw some people mention this earlier on as well about fisheye lenses. Fisheye lenses are a little bit more specialist, and these lenses usually have a full 180 degrees angle of view. Okay, can anybody tell me what type of photograph we would expect with a fisheye lens? Okay, so what I mean, yeah, exactly, Dave. You're totally spot on there as well. So, Richard, you're spot on there too. Okay, Sebastian, you're saying panoramic. You could certainly use a fisheye lens to create a panoramic, but there's a very distinct style of photograph that we get with our fisheye lenses, and because we get such an extreme angle of vision, we get photographs that tend to be very distorted at the edges. As you can see, fisheye lenses really distort the images, and it's very, very prominent around the edges. The name fisheye comes from how fish actually see underwater. Their outside view of the world when they look up. This is also known as a hemispherical view. A hemispherical view because it sees 180 degrees vision. Okay, which is far, far more than our angle of view of 130 degrees. So these give you an amazing sense of perspective in images, and they're a lot of fun to use. You quite often see them in extreme sports. So if you think about GoPros, for example, GoPros are probably the types of cameras that are most synonymous now with fisheye. They're very, very wide and designed that way to try and keep everything in focus as well. Yeah, and Alina, you've just said it there, a typical GoPro. So you would certainly would be very, very familiar with those types of lenses from those GoPros. But they're also, you'd see them used, I think, a lot in surfing. Skateboarding is the one that comes to mind. Music photography as well. You would certainly see them a lot being used in that type of photography too. They're a very, very creative lens. And then finally, we have our macro lenses as well. And as we saw in lesson 1, macro photography is a fantastic way to see small objects and details in a totally new way. To get up really close to tiny objects, you need to have specialized macro lenses or a lens with a macro function. So our macro functions on our cameras will allow us to get a little bit closer, but if you really want to get even closer to the point where you're almost perhaps seeing fibers or textures on an object, you may need to have a look at a macro lens. Now, this one here is a 100mm macro lens. Okay, so that means that we can keep a little bit of distance from our subject and still get very close to them. So in other words, things like if we're photographing, say, insects, or macro wildlife, where we can't disturb, the wildlife, but we need to still get in very, very close. This type of lens is what would be very, very useful for that as well. But you can get wider macro lenses as well. So you could get a 50mm macro lens, which means you'd have to physically get closer to the object, but they would be very useful for things like food photography and so on. Okay, so you can get incredibly, creative with your macro lenses. We looked at this guy's work in the first lesson as well, and you can, David Gilliver uses a lot of, does a lot of macro photography, and he uses these little figures to interact with everyday objects, and he does that through his macro lenses as well. Okay, so guys, that's it for this evening. Okay, so we covered quite a lot tonight. We had a look at the various types of lenses, and we had a look at some of the common functions that we would find on our cameras as well. And all of this is going to extending your vocabulary around photography, meaning that you're going to be able to talk about your photography with more knowledge. You're going to understand the terminology in your cameras as well. And this will also help you, as I said, if you're thinking about investing a little bit more in your photography as well. So congratulations. You have just completed lesson 2. Do attend all lessons live, to benefit the most. But if you need to contact us at all, you can contact us at photography@shawacademy.com. Our next lesson is going to be in your student login area on Friday, and this is going to be with our other educator, Thomas Woods. Okay, and this is on light and exposure. So we're going to be having a look at over and under exposure, how the human eye works, how the camera actually captures and records light, and understanding how this affects our photography. So remember, this is going to go into your student login area on Friday. It's not a live lesson, it's an on-demand lesson that you will find in your student login area. Remember, we'll be back then next week for that prize draw during lesson 4 as well. Okay? To remind you about those toolkits, loads of questions coming in on the toolkits. They will be available for you in your student login area. I was saying at the start of the lesson there was a little bit of a delay on the first one, but that should be available for you now in your student login area with the webinar slides, the summary notes, and you've got those 2 bonus videos with myself on all different camera equipment, on different, more on lenses, there's more on cameras, there's more on accessories and so on as well. In terms of your assignments as well, I can see a lot of people asking about the assignments too. The recordings will be available in your student login area. They go up 24 hours after the live lesson. At the end of the week on Friday, you will get your weekly assignments. These are for fun. These are to practice everything out that we've been talking out throughout the lessons during the week. And there will be a final assignment as well at the very end of the course. But you'll find that weekly assignment there on Friday as well. You can interact with us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Snapchat as well. So at Shaw Academy on Twitter, facebook.com/Shaw Academy, and shaw.academy on Snapchat too. And I did set a challenge for you as well. This is just for fun. This is just a way for you to interact with us on Facebook as well. And simply post up a photograph of a style that you would like to master or a style that you are currently developing. So just go to facebook.com/Shaw Academy. You can like the page, and if you use the hashtag Shaw Photo, you can pop up your photograph and enter your example. Now, I did see a couple of people ask before the lesson as well. I posted up a photograph. It still hasn't appeared on it. Don't worry, it takes a little bit of time. Obviously, we have to screen the photographs to make sure that the content is appropriate, so it can take a little bit of time before your photograph appears. Okay, so that's it, guys. We could do a Q&A now. I will be back with you live for lesson 4 on motion and depth. A really important lesson. We'll be having a look at camera shutter speeds. We'll be having a look at your camera's apertures as well. But of course, our competition winner will be announced. Remember, lesson 3 is an on-demand lesson. It's not live and will be available in your student login area on Friday. So we've actually managed to finish up on time. So if you have any questions at all, we can do a Q&A for you now. Okay, so I saw loads and loads of questions coming in. So let's try to grab some of those now. Kuldeep, you're asking, what is A-dep on the dial? So some of you may have a camera that says A-dep. That is automatic depth of field, Kuldeep. I don't recommend that you use that mode. Basically, your camera is going to try and select an f-stop, an aperture for you to use. I don't think it's a good mode at all, as it often gets it wrong. And as we're going to see in lesson 4 anyway, you're going to take control of that aperture using the aperture priority mode. Punit, you're asking about EF and EF lenses. They are talked about in the gear guide. Okay, so the course focuses on specifically on capturing photographs, okay, and understanding our cameras. But in terms of talking about more technical questions like sensor sizes, like what. Sorry, I've forgotten your name there. What you're sorry, Punit asking about the EF and the EFS lenses. That's all covered in the camera gear guide in your student login area. So do check that out. It'll answer loads of your questions. Adele, I can see your questions coming in there. Yeah, you're typing into the correct place. Trying to get some more questions. Sonia, you're asking, your camera has a dial that says C2, C3, C1, B, and so on. These are custom functions. They're custom functions. Sonia, I'd say check out your camera's manual as well. Okay, they're quite specific to your own camera, but they are custom functions. Richard, you're asking, what is AEL? It's auto exposure lock. It'll allow you to lock exposure in certain situations. I wouldn't worry about that for the moment, Richard, okay? Adrian, you're asking, why is there a macro function even if the lens is not macro? Well, all lenses will have a certain close focusing distance, Adrian. So in other words, each lens is going to be able to get, quite close to a certain object. Depending on the lens, that's going to vary. And basically, the macro mode, Adrian, tries to get the most out of that close focusing distance. We'll be talking about bulb mode in lesson 4. I see some people asking about bulb mode. We'll talk about that in lesson 4. Where can you access the previous lessons? On our website, shawacademy.com. Log in there with your email and your password, and you can check out the lessons that you may have missed. We've only had the one lesson and this lesson, so only 2 lessons so far. Lesson 4 is start of next week. I don't have a name there. Someone that's asking about lesson 4. That's going to be the start of next week. Some people saying they can't access the toolkit. Don't worry, that should be available for you after the lesson, so you'll be able to access it after this lesson, okay? What is a stabilizer on a lens, Boomy, you're asking? Image stabilizers will allow you to, shoot at slightly longer shutter speeds if necessary. So basically, they try to reduce the amount of camera shake, the camera blur that's in your photograph, okay? We do cover them again in the gear guide. We'll speak about them a little bit later on. And Prashana, you're asking something similar. What's VR? Well, it's the same thing. It's an image stabilizer. VR is vibration reduction. Stephen, you're asking how can you output the or manipulate the color output of the pictures? It's to do with your software, Stephen. In that particular case, you need to have some type of software to do that. Abbas, you're asking what is auto bracketing? Auto bracketing is a technique that we can use to take multiple exposures of the same subject without having to change the settings each time. The camera will change it for us. It's a little bit advanced at this stage. I actually only spoke about it last night with my advanced photography students in relation to HDR. But basically, it'll allow you to take different exposures without having to change the exposure every time. Um, Ian, you said you bought a Canon 70D last week, and you want to know if it's a good camera for beginners. It's absolutely. It's even more for the. It would be considered a semi-professional camera, so that's going to be a camera that's going to last you for a very very long time. Sahana, you're asking, is the sports mode the best for baby photography? Not necessarily. It will be helpful if the baby is a little bit older and moves around a lot, but I actually think the portrait mode might be better. But I would say, Sahana, that when we have a look at the aperture priority mode next week, that would be the one to be using for photographing a baby. Moran, you're saying, can I control the ISO with shutter speed? No, you're getting a little bit confused there, but we will speak about that at a later stage. Okay, we'll have a look at how to control those things a little bit later on, throughout the lesson. Let's see. I'm just trying to. We're going to be looking at focus in lesson 9. I can see Mariam. You're asking how do you focus on your subject? Will you lightly press the shutter button down, Mariam, and the camera will begin to focus for you. Make sure you're not switched to manual focus, but we will also be having a look at that in depth in lesson 9. What's a USM lens, Vino, you're asking? If USM lens is an ultrasonic motor, it's a faster focus, okay? So it's designed to focus a lot quicker. That's quite specific to Canon. Metering. Sorry, very excited about that. So what is metering? Naja, metering is, we're going to have a look at that in lesson 7. It's how our camera reads light, okay? And it's very important to understand because we make our exposure off of that, okay? So we'll talk about that in lesson 7. Yvonne, you're asking how will we enter into the Premium Plus membership? Is it based on the live attendance? Yes, it is, Yvonne. So attending it's lesson 4 live, you'll be entered into that draw. But because you attended the lesson this evening as well, Yvonne, your name is going to go in there twice as well. So you've actually got double the chance of winning, and that goes for everybody who attended live tonight. And if you attend lesson 4 live as well, you've got a second chance of winning as well. Your name will go into the draw twice. Lots of people asking me about specific type of cameras. What I would say about the cameras that you're using, guys, because I see loads of people asking. I've got a Nikon P520, I've got a Sony Alpha 3000, I have a Nikon D3300, and so on. The best camera that you can be using is the one that you have at the moment. Okay, I would want you to ask yourselves a question. Do you feel that you understand your camera to its maximum capability? Okay, very few of us are going to answer yes to that. So it's only when you can understand your camera to its absolute maximum will you understand its limitations as well. So we still have a long way to go with our photography and with our cameras. Okay, so you're going to see just how much you can get out of your camera as we go on and continue on throughout this course. So don't worry about, if a lot of people asking, is my camera good enough? It is absolutely going to be good enough, as we'll see throughout this course. Okay, just going to grab a couple of more questions just before we finish up. Paul, you're saying, I noticed some Canon lenses have a red ring around them and some don't. Why is that? It's to do with their quality. Red ring lenses are known as L series lenses, Paul, and basically the L stands for luxury. Okay, so these are just higher quality lenses. I suppose if you were to put them into a bracket, you would call those professional lenses, Paul. I don't really like using that word because they're not, specifically used for professional photography, but basically it would be a higher quality lens. D, you're saying your 50mm lens will only work in manual mode on my Nikon camera. That's because you're using the D version of it, okay? So with the Nikon lenses in particular, there's two versions of that 50mm lens. There's a 50mm D and there's a 50mm G. Okay, the G is designed for newer cameras. The D version is an older one, and like you've said, it'll only work in manual mode because it's a manual lens. It's a lot cheaper, but that's the big downside to it, okay? It's still a good lens, and it's a good way to learn D, so I wouldn't get rid of it by any means. But it just means you need to be a little bit careful, a little bit more thoughtful with it, okay? Wayne, you're asking, what would sport mode be good for runway photographs? Yes, it certainly would be, absolutely. And you would hear it, Wayne. I mean, you'll hear this with the cameras as well. And I'm sure we've all heard it, when we're, again, with sports events, where you hear the shutter going very rapidly, like you're hearing the of the shutter, that's sports mode in action. So, yeah, journalists and so on, they would very much use that mode very, very frequently. Mohammed, what's the best lens for interiors? No, not one specific lens, but a wide lens. Basically, Mohammed, is going to be a good place to start when you're talking about interiors. Peter, you're saying some of us grew up with non-digital SLRs and find manual focus no problem. It is just a case of practicing, Peter. Manual focus is great, but it can be a little bit slow sometimes. Obviously, if you're in a high-pressure situation, Peter, manual focus can be a little bit tricky. It's also in low-light situations can be tricky as well. But yeah, if you've got a bit of experience, I'm sure you find it no problem, Peter. Bizwanat, you're asking how to adjust the manual focus ring on an 18 to 55mm. Well, you'd have to change it to manual focus first of all, but it's going to be at the very front of the lens, Bishwanat, the very, very front of the lens to change that manual focus. Nabila, you're asking, in future, will we be able to get access to the course notes before the lessons? No, I mean, we want to encourage you to attend the lessons, okay? If we were to give you the notes before the lessons, there's a chance that you would just look at the notes and not join us. And we want you to be here to learn, okay? So that's why we don't give the lessons before, okay? We give them afterwards. What's noise on a camera? Noise is to do when we shoot at very high ISOs. Now, we'll speak about this much later on. It's not something to be worried about, but we will discuss it in lesson 8. Paul, you're asking the question that I get asked about 100 times every lesson. What's a better brand, Canon or Nikon? There's absolutely no correct answer to that one at all, Paul. It absolutely depends on what you're after with your cameras, okay? They each have their strengths, they each have their weaknesses, and so on. I'm going to stay well away from that one, Paul. Richard is saying the correct answer is Sony. It's Yvonne, you're saying it's personal taste. It absolutely is. I found, good cameras in all the brands. I've found bad cameras in all the brands afterwards as well. It really, really depends on the particular model, I think, rather than the brand instead. Zial, you're asking, how can I apply for the premium membership? Well, we'll speak about that in lesson 4, okay? So we'll have information about that in lesson 4. Imane, you're asking, what camera do I use? I've got a variety of cameras. At the moment, I'm using an old Canon AE1. That's an old film camera, so I've gone back to shooting on film for the moment. I have a nice little Olympus mirrorless camera as well that I use on a day-to-day basis. I had a Canon 5D Mark II. I'm actually without, I suppose, a professional quality digital camera at the moment. I am in between cameras at the moment, if I'm honest. What's my favourite camera, Imri? Well, I used to have an old Veronica, a medium format camera. It was a film camera as well that I absolutely loved. Unfortunately, it gave up the ghost there a couple of weeks ago. It's just gone. I can't get it repaired. But yeah, certainly that was my favourite one. Okay. Christina, is a 25mm lens good for vlogging and photo shoots? Yeah, that is a good lens, Christina, because it's nice and wide. So for that type of work, you'll actually find it a lot easier to focus with a wider lens. Okay, so yeah, I think that's a good one to be using. Are Leica cameras overrated? They're overpriced. I wouldn't say overrated. That's kind of a tough one. It's when you use one of them, you kind of get the reasons why people like them so much. They're just incredibly expensive. Is the only problem with them. But the quality is absolutely phenomenal from those. But they're tough cameras to use as well. They're a little bit of a different idea. They're called rangefinder cameras. So when you look through them, you're not actually looking directly through the lens. So they're a little bit tough. Okay, a little bit tough to use. My view on Russian cameras, Randy. Russia has an incredible history with photography. Okay, so Russian cameras are great because they quite often will do very high quality cameras, particularly film cameras that are nowhere near as expensive as I suppose, as the Japanese or the American cameras. What time are we at, guys? Okay, we'll get a couple of more questions just before we finish up. What's a good lens for portrait photography? A 50mm lens is a great place to start for portrait photography. I really think it's a lens that every photographer should have in their kit. A 50mm 1.8. You'll find them for every single camera that's out there, every single brand, and they're very, very affordable as well. Garrett, you're saying you're desperate for the Sigma 150 to 600mm lens. What's my thoughts? It's a tough lens to use, Garrett. It's also a massive lens as well. If you are after doing wildlife photography or bird watching and so on, it is a great alternative to the Canon or the Nikon versions, or whatever brand it happens to be using. It's a very, very popular lens, but it's tricky to use. There's a lot of considerations you have to take in with a lens like that, Garrett. You don't have a very wide aperture on it. I think it's f4 to 5.6. So when you're at the 600mm, your widest aperture is 5.6, which isn't going to let in a massive amount of light. That means you need to keep your shutter speeds up very, very high and so on. But this is something that we'll talk about a little bit later on down the line. I wouldn't say go for it straight away, Gareth. I'd say learn a little bit more. I'm a big advocate of learning before making these types of investments. But it is a great lens. Teresa, you're asking, what do we think about using old screw lenses on a newer camera? I do it quite often, actually. I have a little mount that I can use for attaching my film lenses onto my camera. You will lose all control over them in terms of their aperture and the camera's ability to read it. So it becomes fully manual. So you're having to focus manually. You have to set your aperture manually as well. But it's a good way to learn, and it reminds me of using film cameras. So it's kind of a throwback to shooting on film. So I'm a big advocate of using those as well. Sean, yeah, you're saying thanks for my honest advice. I was preparing to spend more money on lenses. Yeah, we photographers often suffer from this thing called GAS. You may have heard of this acronym called GAS before, which is Gear Acquisition Syndrome. So when we start photographing, we very much just want to buy the latest and the greatest equipment, very, very quickly, and we should try to hold off and learn what we have first of all. Hannah, what's a good lens for underwater photography or water photography? Again, wide angle lenses are useful there because it's such a tricky scenario to be photographing in. Why are low f value lenses expensive? Mohammed is asking. Because they let in more light very quickly. They're called fast lenses now. We'll speak about this again in lesson 4 when we talk about our apertures. But they let in far more light. That means we can use them in much lower light situations. So they're very valuable for that reason. But they are also very expensive for that reason as well. Is a lens hood compulsory to have? No, it's not at all, but it is useful to have, okay? Peter, are there adapters for the OM10 lenses to fit modern cameras? I can't remember what the amount is for an OM10 lens. If it's a screw mount, there will be an adapter for it for sure, because they're M42 mounts. There's a universal adapter for them. You'd have to check it out online, Peter. Unfortunately, don't know the answer to that one off the top of my head. Can all cameras change lenses, Shelby? No, they can't. So all DSLR cameras can change lenses, but bridge cameras cannot. Okay, so if you have, you may have missed lesson 1, Shelby. So if you go back to lesson 1, you'll see that certain cameras you cannot change the lenses on them. Okay. So, guys, I'm just having a look at the time. I think we're going to leave it there for this evening, okay? So, I do hope you enjoyed the lessons this week. Remember, you're going to have your lesson on Friday with Thomas Woods. That's an on-demand lesson that's in your student login area, so that one won't be live. It'll be posted up there for you. You can check it out over the weekend. I'll be back with you for the start of next week for lesson 4. Really, really important lesson on motion and depth, okay? So, thanks once again, and I'll see you all back here very, very soon. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.